Hello, hello. We're going to get started because we have another fabulous panel. Just a couple of housekeeping thoughts for you. This room is not well regulated in terms of heat, hot and cold maybe, all right? If you are cold, move up because it's very warm up there. If you're hot, move down because it's very cold down here. And the panelists on the stage can tell you how chilly. It's about 10 degrees difference in the room. So do take care of yourselves, all right? Now that you have the information. The second thing, again, I want to draw to your attention Derek Cohen, Amelia Hoover Green, and Elizabeth Wood's special report. I just want to let you know that the United States Institute of Peace funds peace scholars, that means PhD candidates, as well as grantees. And part of the specialness, beyond the fact that it's an excellent, excellent special report, it is very special to us as an institute to have 3 former peace scholars, that is Derek Cohen, Amelia Hoover Green, and Libby Wood, who have come together to write this special report. I would add that Libby Wood is also a former grantee of the institute. So please use our resources. We are mandated by Congress to give 1/4 of our budget away every year to nonprofits, fellows, grantees. So we are an excellent resource, and we like cutting-edge issues and innovations. I will tell you, we were funding Libby Wood in the 80s on some of these issues. We were ahead of that curve, and we want to continue to be. So please let us know how we can support you. All right, with one last announcement. We really value the questions and believe that the questions coming from the audience are key to opening up new ideas. And we will make sure that this time we'll make sure your questions are heard. And the second, if for some reason we don't get to your question, there is a question board out there. Please use it. We're trying to have as much communication as possible. It is tough to manage one of these panels, I will tell you, because there's so much good information. But we want to make sure we get these ideas out there, so please know that we're going to try to take 5 questions at a time this time. So without further delay, Kim, Inger, panel, thank you.
We may not get to all 5 in the answers, but we promise to take 5 in a batch this time. Okay, so thanks for joining us for panel 4. This is almost the flip side of the conversation we just had. We're going to focus on survivors of sexual violence in armed conflict. And to do that, we have just another fantastic panel of experts to share their work and their experiences working with survivors. I'm just going to jump right into very brief introductions. We're going to structure this the same way we structured the last session. And so I'm just going to name the affiliations of our panelists and then turn it over to them to give you a snapshot about the work they do and also one surprising or really interesting thing they've learned in the years of working with survivors of this type of harm. So first we have Dr. Chris Dolan from the Refugee Law Project in Kampala, Uganda. And we have Veronica Mwanafunzi, who is an independent consultant now in Kampala also, that has done much work in this area, including with the World Bank. Dr. McCann Yang from Kenyatta National Hospital in Nairobi, Kenya, where she specializes in HIV-positive patients and also runs the Gender Violence Recovery Center at that hospital. We have Francine Nabintu from Heal Africa in Eastern DRC. And then Dr. Rocio Silva Santisteban from the coordination, I don't know this, I can't pronounce the Spanish version, of the National Coordinator for Human Rights in Peru. And then Mariana Senjak from Medica Zenica in Bosnia. So please, let's start with Dr. Dolan. Please give us your snapshot.
Thank you very much. Just to say very briefly, whatever I say today will be coming out of the work that we do with male survivors and LGBTI survivor refugees, both in northern Uganda, in urban Kampala, and in the various refugee settlements in Uganda. And there we're dealing with refugees coming from Congo, Rwanda, Burundi, Somalia, Ethiopia, and Eritrea. But much of our experience, particularly with the two groups I'm talking about, is a lot coming from Congo, Rwanda, Burundi.
One surprising or interesting fact?
Something surprising. I think something which probably is a bit, in terms of the male survivors, the thing which is maybe surprising to many given the discussion about taboos and so on, is that survivors do want to talk. And what actually matters is whether you are able to create the right space for that discussion to take place. So to the extent that people don't seem to want to talk, it's because they've internalized the taboos and you haven't created the right space to break through those.
Thank you. I have been on this for the last 15 years, mainly focusing on sexual violence, more so as a human rights commissioner, and then turned to a human rights practitioner. Because in Uganda, I was a member of the Uganda Human Rights Commission, which all of you know is one of the best in Africa. We just won the best practice from the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. And when I left the commission, I'm now a human rights practitioner. And issues of sexual violence, issues of vulnerable people, how they are treated, how they should be treated are very, very close to my heart. And then the other thing is I have been in the peace process or peace processes since 1985. So I busy myself and I make it my duty to try and get as many women who are, of course, survivors of sexual violence, survivors of rape, survivors of torture, and get them as early as possible to the peace table. I use the principle of inclusiveness, principle of participation, so that they take conduct of what happens to them from the very beginning. And of course, we try as much as possible with the researchers and the other people that I work with, groups in Uganda, groups in the Great Lakes region. I've now extended my activities to the Africa, using the African Union to try and get them to the mediation table. I have been there as a facilitator, a negotiator, and a mediator. But not all of them can get there. So their efforts, their voices must get to the mediation table. And then the interesting thing I want to share is I have been moving around and going to the rebel regions, talking to the leaders of the rebel groups, particularly Joseph Kony. And in Sierra Leone, I went mainly asking for the early release. As we talk peace, please give us the women, give us the children. And I've made friendship in those areas. And when one day we were coming home, they told me, Veronica, we do not want Kony to be tried in The Hague. We want Kony to be tried in Uganda so that we look at him and he sees us and he sees what him and his commanders did to us.
Thank you, Veronica. Dr. McCann Yang.
Yeah. I'm a consultant psychiatrist and head of the mental health services in the Teaching and Referral Hospital in Kenya. The hospital is basically mandated to train medical workers and establish best practices in services. So as head of the mental health services, we started the Gender-Based Violence Center in 2006. That's soon after we enacted our Sexual Offences Act. our the laws with regard to sexual offenses were very weak before, but through lobbying by some of our legislators, especially the female legislators and the public, we managed to legislate for the Sexual Offences Act, and it was soon then that we saw the need to establish services in a one-stop center where the survivors who previously used to wander from one place of the hospital to the other were now able to access services in one place. My experience started with sexual violence started in 2000 when we joined a group of military, I led a team, civilian team of mental health workers from our hospital with the armed forces to Sierra Leone to intervene at that time when many of the armed forces were surrounded by the RUF rebels, and we did some stress management there. And we also got to meet to visit the combatants, the young boys who literally clung to us at that time when we were taking photos, craving for a mother or family. We could see they were craving for something. And by then they clung to us. That is in the rehab center where they were. And I realized there was a huge gap there, but we couldn't manage that work. Then sexual post-election violence, I was very much involved in 2007 when this violence spread in the whole of Kenya, and we had to actually intervene, and we had to do some outreach, visit some of the camps where these survivors were, and some eventually trickled in to our center, where up to last year, we continued to give them support. My experience is that human beings have resilience and can actually bounce back with the proper care, comprehensive care that is availed to them. It's amazing that people can bounce back and lead normal lives, including the children. And that makes us very happy to see that there's something we can do.
Thank you, Dr.
Yes, I'm a gender advisor assistant in South Africa, and part of my work is to work on capacity building of local staff on how to integrate gender in their programs. And we also conduct researches to assess our programs. The most surprising thing that I have realized through my work is almost what she said, a lot of resilience in survivors. I have noticed that they are able to be empowered to live their post-rape life where they are stronger and more independent.
Hi, I was an academic, I am an academic all my life, and I made some research about women, gender, sexual violence. But 2 years ago, I'm the director of this national coordinator of human rights in my country. We are 81 NGOs in the whole country, and now I am working very close to the victims. And I mean that I learn from the victims that they want to share not only their testimonies, but also their opinion about transitional justice, trials, prosecutors, and so on. And I mean that, like academic, we need to hear their voices. For me, it's the most important point and issue now, no? To hear their voices.
I would like to greet you on behalf of clients and associates of Women Therapy Center Medica Zenica, Bosnia Herzegovina. Medica Zenica was established 20 years ago in April 1993 in aim to provide shelter, gynecological, general medical, psychological, and legal support to the war rape survivors. These groups of clients extended to the survivors of concentration camps, torture, later on to the survivors of domestic violence and trafficking in human beings. We could speak later on about center and the treatment. And what surprised me and what encouraged me in work with clients, this is the humanity in extreme conditions. Examples of humanity in concentration camps when women help another rape women, or when men stop additional torture against a rape survivor, or when one woman neighbor in Ahmići, in village where the biggest massacre happened, show the roads how to escape from the house and save her and children. These stories are not told. These stories are hidden, sometimes because of safety reasons, and there is only one book in region of former Yugoslavia, Good People in Hard Times. And also this side of story, what we hear from in trauma work with our clients is to be told and keep us in balance. With all these atrocities from one side, on the way gave a balance that we can keep going our work and still trust in human beings and human nature.
Thank you. Okay, so now we would love to ask some individual questions of you. And again, we don't have so much time, but maybe 5 or 6 minutes to unpack a little bit of your work, and then we will turn it over for broader discussion. But I'd like to start with Dr. McCann Yang, actually. And you mentioned, Doctor, the work that the GVRC, Gender Violence Recovery Center at Kenyatta National Hospital, did during the post-election violence in Kenya in late 2007, early 2008. Could you tell us a little bit about the survivors you saw and what their needs were and what you were able to do for them?
Yeah, the survivors we saw came in much later. The initial group of survivors around came in December, January. The elections were in December. And then in January, the people who came in had physical injuries, gunshot wounds, multiple cuts. But the sexual survivors, most of them started trickling in around March and April. One, because it was a lot safer. It was easier now to access the hospitals because the roads had been barricaded. And two, many had started developing post-traumatic stress disorders, and the NGOs and the health workers in the communities were not able to handle them. So then we started seeing them there, and we continued to see them provide psychosocial supports. Their needs are quite challenging. First and foremost, they were concerned about their medical illnesses, and some of them contracted HIV. Some of them were actually raped by armed forces. And they felt threatened because they knew who they were, and they developed the STIs and HIV infection. So others came a bit late, so that we could not really give them post-exposure prophylaxis, but just now manage them probably on post, care after that. And others had other concerns like insecurity. They lacked homes, shelter, they didn't have places to go, and lack of income, because you find their small businesses that they were doing in the community had been disrupted. And they required also legal intervention and assistance, and to know way forward, what help could we do for them. So luckily we partnered with partners. We have NGOs and organizations in Nairobi, legal organizations offering pro bono services, and one of the ladies is Lydia, sitting there, who did a lot of work with our survivors, and they really, really helped us in trying to assist them so that they could get at least justice. Yeah.
Thank you. And are you engaged in any sort of research? I think you had mentioned to us earlier that there are some initiatives at the center.
Yes, right now we are trying to, because we are trying to talk about one-stop services in one center where a survivor doesn't have to walk up and down. So we are trying to set up a best practice. Remember, I said as a teaching hospital, we have to roll out services that we develop. And we are actually looking at doing a study on to describe the services for the last 2 years offered at the GBV not just describing them. We want to look at the psychiatric morbidity and look for anxiety among the survivors who we're going to call back. And also we want to look at their outcome, the medical outcome and the social outcome, on how are they coping now. And that is about it's 5 years down the line. So I think this is an interesting study. There's already one I've done that's already been published, but this one we were just looking at screening for intimate partner violence, because we thought some studies have said after such conflicts you're likely to have more intimate partner violence. So we actually, that's been published under the USAID AFIA project, where we found it is acceptable in our hospital. We are now just about to publish the results of the feasibility to see, is it feasible to screen for intimate partner violence? So those are some of the studies we are doing.
Thank you. I wonder if we could turn it over to Francine to tell us a little bit about the type of services you provide for survivors of sexual violence at Heal Africa.
Okay. At Heal Africa, we have a holistic approach to supporting survivors. It means that we have medical care, we have legal system, and then we work in partnership with the American Bar Association to provide legal support. But we also have this economic integration and trauma counseling. But above all, we have also the work with their communities to strengthen community ownership over intervention. And this is very interesting because we know that many outside intervention has a short-term character. So we do a lot of work with their community. And the network Wamama Simameni, which means Women Stand Up Together, is a good illustration of how this process works. So this network Wamama Simameni started as women safe houses that offered referral points for Heal Africa. And later in time, they changed into community centers. And many members of this network used to be survivors, but now to mitigate stigma, they work with other women in the community. So they came and had some training on microcredit. They create cooperatives and communal bank with a lending scheme open to the entire community. And now Wamama Simameni continues to offer referral services to Heal Africa, trauma counseling, and many trainings, increasingly independent of any outside support. And moreover, they have also the network with local leaders and carry out advocacy campaigns around issues of great importance to them. So our work at Heal Africa, we don't only focus on the survivor, but beyond the individual, we also work in their community for the ownership of the intervention.
And then Dr. Silva Santisteban, can you tell us a little bit about your work and also the social perceptions of survivors of conflict-related sexual violence in Peru?
But I want to share this spot.
Sure, yes.
Do you remember?
Okay, so we have a little video clip that
Yes, 1 minute
the doctor
only.
would like to show. Can we cue that now?
¿Acaso los militares nos arrogaron para ser violados? Nos han dicho, oigan señora, quiero estar con ustedes. Nos han maltratado desgraciadamente. Yo quisiera justicia, yo no quisiera que este quede impune. Nos sentimos impotentes, ¿no? al poder no poder hacer nada, ¿no?
30 years to looking for justice. No? Okay, I want to talk about some background of my country. Between the 1980s and 2000, Peru was the stage of a period of extreme violence between various groups, such as, for example, the Peruvian Communist Party, Shining Path, Sendero Luminoso. The MRTA is the revolutionary movement Tupac Amaru, and of course the state forces. And this confrontation resulted in 69,000 deaths, according to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And both organizations deny and blame each other to spiraling violence. And a large indifferent sector in the country tried to ignore the people most affected by this war through different strategies of symbolic trashing. This is my point. What means symbolic trashing? The process of this symbolic trashing was used as a way of dehumanizing, the other, the body of the other, but also the subject identity, and submerging him or her inside a residual logic to use them in order to assure its instrumentalization. I mean that these strategies of political violence originate in this symbolic trashing. Of course, it's mutual. This situation allowed authoritarian discourses, several authoritarian discourses, and use the bodies of women. I would like to point out that this spot was filmed in a seminar, in a symposium, with huge prosecutors, state actors, and NGO activists. And this seminar was organized by my organization, this national coordinator, and also by young women, United Nations women, no? And was the first time in 30 years, in more than 20 years, of course, that more than 20 women speak about not only their lives, but also about trials, face-to-face to prosecutors and academics also. And I mean, this is very important, no? To talk about the voice and the position of the victims in this kind of symposium, no? Who are they and where are the victims? The victims, of course, here are outside, no? In those pictures, outside this auditorium, and this also in that testimonies. But for me, it's also important that the victims will be here, not that here, to explain their opinion about trials, about attorneys, about reparations, about policies. Okay, this is the first step.
Okay. I think we're just planting seeds to unpack in the larger Q&A, so thank you. And then, Mariana Senyak, can you tell us a little bit about not just your work and the survivors that you see at the center, but more about the relationship you alluded to, about the short-term and then long-term experiences and needs that the survivors you see have?
Maybe to continue on yesterday's discussion and just to the stakeholders to add some committed individuals, because Monika Hauser, a feminist gynecologist from Germany, came to Bosnia in the middle of the war and recruit local professionals and trusted them that they are able to assess the needs of the clients. And then in 4 months, a center grow very fast and respond to the needs of protection of physical health and psychological health of our clients, and to the family integration, and to the education in sense of trainings for in vocational training, in courses in upholstery, hairstyling, some economic empowerment, what was going on, like provide them recognized certification in this vocational training, and also some attempts to do mediation for their employment. And just a few points on sensibilization, just to add to yesterday's discussion on the community in the middle of the war with Islamic fatwa, what was issued in 1992, in the beginning of the war in Bosnia, where influential Islamic priest, Reis Ulema, head of Islamic community, asked consultations with influential Islamic lawyers from Cairo University to help to issue the fatwa, what said that women who survive war rape is not sinful, that children born out of rape are equal parts of our community, and that it was recommendations given to young men in mosques during the prayer that if they come to the relationship, that they could acquaint or marry a girl who was raped. So in 1992, this sensibilized community, but we didn't get this sensibilization 10 years later. And we didn't get involvement of religious leaders from other sides, other ethnic sides. And maybe just this is one of the factors, this sort of sensibilization in the community, what influence, moderate the reporting on domestic violence later. Also with empowerment, with reinforcing the laws on family law and law against violence in the family. So we can, some researches show increase of domestic violence, increase of violence against children, increase of community violence, so-called street violence in post-conflict societies. But also we need epidemic studies. We need a comparison of the data from before the war. And also strengthening referral mechanisms. If you issue the law and go the reporting mechanisms, so you could get more victims to report than it was like offense of public order, not offense of any offense of qualified as a violence. So we need to observe the circumstances in the concrete community to make this comparison. And the one research what Medica Zenica did, to live without violence, is the title of the research, show that 49% of women, inhabitant women in the town and refugee women, it was a sample of 500 women, suffer some form of violence, either psychological, either physical, either sexual, either economical. And also some research on recognition of forms of violence conducted on high school students show that children and students can easily recognize this form of physical violence, but hardly recognize sort of psychological violence. And it was interesting for it was aimed on assessing their ability to recognize and refer, ask for the support to institutions if they would be involved in sort of recruiting for trafficking in human beings. So they perceive police as the most trustful side to report, to ask for the support. And later we can speak more. Maybe about treatment. I don't want to take time now, but maybe later, just to compare with what colleague in previous panel elaborate.
Sure. So if someone
Yeah,
can ask
very
about
precisely.
treatment later, that would be much appreciated. Okay, well, we'll make sure we address treatment later then.
Yeah.
All right. Dr. Dolan, the Refugee Law Project, you serve refugee communities in Uganda, but also have become quite known for your work with male and also LGBTI survivors. Can you tell us a little bit about those cases, specific, and if there are specific client needs or challenges in those cases in particular, and if there's a call for a change in our understanding about response and prevention when we're talking about particularly marginalized groups?
Thank you. Now you've given me both my questions at once.
Do with them what you will.
Yeah, you've thrown my order out of order. But
Tell us about male survivors and LGBTI survivors first.
I'll start with the experiences, with a fairly blunt statement. I mean, I think that most people, when they think about sexual violence against men, think about anal rape, and certainly that's a very central component. But just last week, we were interviewing a new group of survivors that we had not talked with before in one of the settlements, and in addition to anal rape, they also mentioned being gang raped by captors, these kind of very physical acts, having ropes tied to their genitalia, being pulled around by those ropes, being tied to another man who also has ropes tied to his the same rope, and then they have to walk in opposite directions, being made to dig holes in the ground or put a hole into a banana tree and then rub themselves into that hole to the point of ejaculation. And then there are more kind of, well, still very physical acts, but with clearly a much more sort of psychological dimension added in, being forced to have anal oral sex with fellow detainees, or with their brothers, or their fathers, being forced into sexual acts while being watched by their own children and spouses, being used as a mattress. I think I've read about this in other places, being used as a mattress while soldiers rape their family members on top of them, being held for lengthy periods of time as sexual slaves, having electric wires attached to their genitalia. The stories go on and on. I've been interviewing survivors for quite some time, but last week I heard a bunch of practices that I had not come across before. Even more indirect ones, I think the whole issue of children born of rape. I have talked to men who have struggled massively with how do I bring up my enemy's child. They're still with their wives. The child is clearly a child born of rape. And they're having to bring up this child that belongs to the enemy, at least in some respects. I think the challenge is that when you add in for LGBTI survivors, and here it's both in the country's origin, but also in the country of asylum as well. There we see a kind of repeated pattern of people, much more social problems of not being able to hold down a job, not being able to stay in a particular housing situation because the minute their difference is uncovered, they get kicked out or asked to leave. Ongoing rapes. Many LGBTI refugees are also engaging in sex work because nothing else is available. And then in that sex work, they become targets of sexual violence, ongoing hate speech, and so on. So the challenges are multiple in terms of what people experience directly. Once it comes to the issue of services, I think one of the big challenges, there is virtually no signaling by organizations that they are willing to engage in any of these issues. And so I think one of the first things I would recommend is that if service providers are to work on this, there needs to be clear signaling or messaging to men that sexual violence against them is within the thought universe, if you like, of the service providers. I mean, how many posters have any of us ever seen dealing with sexual violence and depicting men as victims? Maybe you could put your hand up if you've ever seen such a poster. One. Two. You can go to a place like Goma in eastern DRC, and there are whole streets with really quite good posters painted onto them in terms of sexual violence against women, but there's not a single one that I've seen where men are the victim. That then has to be backed up in terms of the services provided. For example, I interviewed somebody about clinical management of male survivors. Is there any training in that clinical management of their cases? And some of the damage is done, are very particular around fecal incontinence, around fissures, around damage to the genitalia, around impotence. And there is no specialized clinical training on how to deal with those issues. The last one in particular, the whole question of impotence, then there's a link there, a connection between the physical problems and then the psychological issues around being a male survivor. As some survivors have said to me, it's all very well if you help us to heal our bodies, but what about our minds? And that connection is often expressed through the problems of impotence. I think the other challenge that I should bring up is how do you work with a survivor and then also with the people around that survivor. Many survivors are, as I've said, they isolate themselves, they withdraw, they find it very difficult to deal with their own children, they find it difficult to maintain their relationship with their spouses. So the whole family is very directly affected, or the household, let me say, is very directly affected, and the ways need to be found of engaging not just with the survivor, but also with his family. I think there are many opportunities. It's not, as I said in my opening remarks, it's not so difficult to get men to talk once you can convince them that A, there's confidentiality and it's reasonably safe to talk, and B, that you're going to do something once you've heard about the issues. So you have to link it to some kind of service provision. The other thing that we have seen is that it's not just about providing service. It's if you can create a safe enough space for survivors to come together, a whole other healing process starts, which is beyond the capacity of any service provider, which is much more about people within a group beginning to re-establish a sense of having a social identity, of having some kind of social value, recovering a public voice. There was a very interesting comment made yesterday about shifting not just from being a victim to a survivor, but from a survivor to a stakeholder. And that's what we start to see with the groups, is that over a number of months, having had a lot of very sort of internal discussion, there comes a moment when the more confident group members want to start having a voice and talking about their own issues in their own way. And probably for the less confident ones, for many, that group becomes the closest that they have to a family and are absolutely core to their sense of kind of psychological recovery. Do I still have a moment?
A moment, you do.
Because I wanted to talk about a couple of the sort of bigger picture adjustments that I think we need to make when it comes to thinking about this issue of sexual violence against men in conflict. And please, I hope nobody will feel that if I certainly don't wish to patronize anybody in this room. It's clear from the SRSG's remarks that the issue has been taken on board. My own interactions with UN Women, it's clear the issue is being taken on board. So my comments are really directed at what I would see as the kind of the mainstream to which that has not yet filtered down. So I have a couple of things which I think need to happen. Firstly, I think we need to drop the idea that women are vulnerable and men are not. And that viewpoint, which can also be formulated as women and girls need protection and men can provide it, seems to me to be the central pivot around which patriarchal gender binary hinges. And when you get rid of that viewpoint, the very architecture of patriarchy also crumbles. And I say that, or I highlight it, because I think so much of the work done in the name of protecting women and children actually props up both patriarchy writ large, as well as sustaining the structural power of some men over others in conflict situations. Secondly, I think we need to stop saying that women and girls are disproportionately affected. Why? Because to me, every time I hear that, it sort of implies that there are not enough men and boy victims for us to be bothered about them. And that even if if it does occur, the suffering involved is minimal compared to that experienced by women and girls. And both assumptions are just plain wrong. As one of my colleagues says, pain is pain, regardless of the gender or sexual orientation of the victim. And actually, anyway, we don't even know the figures. In the few places where statistics exist, the gap between male and female survivors is much smaller than the general discourse would have us imagine. All we know for sure is that women seriously underreport sexual violence and men disproportionately underreport relative to women. And we're currently working with Johns Hopkins to develop a screening tool for use in refugee settings, which I hope will, once rolled out, become a better source of data. And I'm being told, I'm getting the nod there, that I should stop at this point.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So note to the audience, he has more on his suggestions. Let's be sure to ask about that. Thanks, Chris. Veronica, your work in the Great Lakes region has been just tremendous from the fact-finding on this issue and also participating in negotiations. And we were curious to know, in that experience, what is your sense of survivors' role in the transitional justice process and how they perceive justice at all and what they want from those processes?
Thank you. Within the Great Lakes region, I have covered, or we have covered with the people that we work with, mainly South Sudan, Uganda, Rwanda, and Burundi. And then these are different types of conflicts, okay. But the other ones, the one that is totally peculiar is the one that Margaret just mentioned, the Kenyan post-election violence. And in all this, you find the groups or the survivors, they come out. I really want to correct this thing that survivors do not want to talk. It depends on the level at which you talk to them. If you're going to talk to them at a level that they cannot comprehend, they will keep quiet. But if you lower yourself and get to their level, give them the time, they will certainly come back and tell you. If you make yourself part of their problem or show that you really care and they see it in your actions and on your face, then they will sit with you and tell you. And like Chris has said, there is so much. And we normally treat it with the organizations that I research with and I work with. We do not treat it as a men and women kind of thing. We treat it as a gender issue, but also we treat it as survivors of sexual violence are just not, they need a lot more help. They're vulnerable, and therefore they need lifting. So most of my allies in the Great Lakes region have, of course, been the World Bank, and without peer, I wouldn't be sitting here. And then through that avenue, I partnered with my greatest ally. I hope she still is, and I know she is, the former Secretary General of the Great Lakes region. She opened up, and we were able to go there. And we worked with the conflict-affected survivors, and we were looking at the areas of, mainly looking at gaps. What can we do? When you talk about research, so much has been done. And these survivors will tell you, Madam, we've been searched, researched, and searched. And, you know, we need solutions. People come here and they take notes, they ask us questions, but they don't come back. And those ethical issues, we have to understand these survivors. They are more intelligent than us. They are the owners. I have a saying in my own language that the owners of the corpse are the people who know more about the smell of it. So make yourself part of it, and then you get the root cause and you get the problem. So the plea really is that they want certain, the research is not an issue. These things have been addressed. But what they need is that their needs are looked at. What are some of the needs? A survivor, like Chris said, of sexual violence, who has come out and there is a child born. Now, we saw the flip side of the man having to contend with a child born by another man. But what about this woman whose child has been born, A, by a man she doesn't like, who forced her, went and destroyed her dignity, and society does not like her, and she has to carry that child. And she has to feed that child. And she has to provide for that child. I mean, I don't want to go into the details, but we all feel with me. The other one is the justice system. We all know, I'm a lawyer and I've been in the judiciary, I still is. The fact, the conventional legal or litigation is so problematic. I think it was mentioned on the floor here yesterday. First of all, it is expensive. It involves a lot of paperwork. Sometimes in the countries where I work with, and somebody will, I mean, a few researchers will agree with me, justice is bought. You have to pay for it sometimes. Indirectly and directly. You go to the police officer, you're asking for police form 3, and you are being told, we don't have the form. Then you say, fine, can I get your original and go and photocopy it? And then you are told, no, give us the money and we'll go and photocopy. And then, of course, they expect no less than a certain amount of money for what would have cost a cent of $1 to photocopy. Then several other things. I mean, I don't need to repeat, but it is that category of protection, the police fearing the army, but it happens in the Great Lakes region. The army is more dominant, they have all the say, and the police will not even help you take a case against the army. This is a military thing and what have you. And then the survivors, I mean, fortunately in the Great Lakes region, we've had sensitive leaders, I must say. Our presidents came together and made sexual violence an issue. And it was then put at the Great Lakes, within the Great Lakes region. And then there was a conference in Kampala in December 2011, where they thrashed out this problem and they gave sexual violence a human face. And the first ladies were so much in the forefront. And the first lady of, I think it was Zambia, who came out, she's a doctor, and she said, look, I know it, she's a doctor, said, I know it from a point of practice. This is what comes to my clinic. This is what I saw in the hospital. And she's telling this, I mean, they're talking about this in the a summit. So the presidents got the message, and then there was a resolution. And these are things which are helping us. So to sum up, we need a coordinated research. We need comprehensive solutions on this matter. We need to engage victims and the survivors in getting to what is good for them. And they have their needs and they know it. And some of the needs that they keep talking about is let's look at not a softer, but a more comprehensive, a more meaningful form of justice. Yes, we want to go to court, but make it easy. Don't go for deeper, for the kind of evidence that you go beyond reasonable doubt, like you are trying a normal criminal case. This is not a normal criminal case. These are bedroom matters. These are things that are done in heinous and hidden whatever. The perpetrators of whatever are cowards. They would not take it in, it's done in the most cruel way. So make it softer. And here then we talk about transitional justice. We talk about issues of transitional justice. We talk about reparations. We talk about compensation. We talk about recovery. I mean, a sexual violence survivor does not want to be miserable and poor. I mean, poverty in the region I'm talking about does not want to be poor and suffer all her life. At least lift her economically. So they want such things. And revenge does not pay. It's good. Sometimes it's enjoyable, but it doesn't pay. And then issues of justice, they want to basically get back, get their dignity. So what is it that we can do, or what researchers can do? That gap where we can restore their dignity, because once somebody already has lifted your skirt, then you've been laid bare and you are ashamed all your life. And so really what I'm stressing is dignity, and they want to be involved. I must underscore this all the time. Inclusiveness. Don't go there without them. Go with them. Thank you.
Thanks, Veronica. Did you want to add something, Francine, before we go to Q&A?
Yeah, I want to say something.
Sure. Okay, briefly.
Yeah. I just wanted to make clear that sexual violence in DRC is only one symptom of a political, cultural, social, and economic problems. But sexual violence is in a context of generalized violence, because we have corruption and impunity that makes the population vulnerable to different forms of violence. And what is yet serious is that we have these agents of state who do not only enable, but they enact violence themselves. And it's now very complicated. If we have civilians who are rapists, and we don't know how to treat them, now we have police who are involved, we have soldiers, and now we know that we have many rebel groups in the east, so understand how complicated this issue is. And further to that is also absence of functioning legal system. In some remote areas, we don't even have prisons. Hill Africa worked with the American Bar Association in Maniema, and they succeeded to convict over a dozen of rapists, but only to see them escape, tearing down a fragile wall of the prison. Another problem is also prostitution, which has become another form of sexual violence. Because the way it is done, it's not somebody's choice, but here it's a question of survival due to extreme poverty, and even UN soldiers take advantage of this economic disequilibrium. So it's very complex.
Okay. Thank you for that. Okay, so I will turn this over to Inger to manage the Q&A part of this panel.
Okay.
It's your turn.
Thank you. Thank you.
Enjoy.
Well, thanks to the panel first for very interesting comments. I made some notes here, and before we turn to the questions, I just want to, in a way, summarize what I've heard, because I think that we've heard about, first of all, different survivors. We've heard about men and women, but we've also heard about children. Are they survivors of sexual violence? Who are they in this context? I think that's an important question to raise. And in your introductory remarks, I noted what we might call building blocks for recovery for individuals and communities. And I just want to repeat what I heard. In that you mentioned that we should create spaces for breaking the silence. We need engagement in transitional justice. We need resilience, or resilience is possible with proper care. We can look at resilience and empowerment together. And that survivors want to share their experiences. You mentioned that. And also the wonderful word from Mariana here that we're talking about good people in hard times. I thought was a wonderful quote, humanity in extreme conditions. So this is what we have laid out before you, or what the panelists have laid out before you. And on that note, we'll open up for questions. And now we promise to take many questions, but you have to promise to be brief. 3 sentences, and say who you are. You go first.
Thank you for a very interesting panel. My name is Pasha Bueno-Hansen. I'm a professor at the University of Delaware. My question is for Dr. Dolan. It's a 2-part question, and I'll keep it brief. First, I would be very interested to hear about your work specifically with LGBTI folks. And second, I was wondering if you could share your insights regarding the workings of heterosexism and homophobia during conflict and post-conflict settings. And one thing that seems to sort of reoccur in our discussions is the problematic slippage between male victims and homosexuality.
The man in the white shirt there.
My name is Pascal from Burundi. I wanted to find out about, from the panels, about the work you have done with the religious leaders or the churches or mosques, Islam, to support what have they done to support the recovery of the survivors, or what are they doing, and what are the challenges you have countered. But one thing I wanted to say, in brief, reflecting in this work, there are so many white people who come to Africa with good intentions, and we appreciate that, as an African.
I'm going to have to ask you to be
yeah. In Burundi, we have so many problems. We tell some of our friends, this is the project we have, come and support us. But as soon as our crazy leaders who are fundamentalist Christians, they want to provide laws that ban homosexuality like it's something that is important for us, immediately we see so many fundamentalists from Texas, from somewhere, and then even those who didn't even bring money to build clinics and just pour with money to build churches. We don't want churches in Africa. We need some of the development projects. That's what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you. In the middle there.
Hi, my name is Hope Wilson. I'm independent here. I just have a quick question in terms of how we've been listening to a lot of panelists.
Can you speak up?
Sorry. My name is Hope Wilson. I'm independent. And I just wanted the panelists maybe to speak more about the notion of justice, the concept of justice. It seems that we've been dealing with a very narrow understanding, and what seems to be coming out is that maybe the victims themselves have a sort of a different understanding on the expectation of what justice is. And for instance, Veronica said justice maybe for some women might need just a restoration of dignity. And I was wondering if maybe other panelists can talk more about the victims they're working with, what they are understanding, what they hope. For instance, in Peru, the ladies that say that we have to make sure we get justice. What is the victim's perception of justice?
Thank you. The lady with glasses there. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Clémence. And so I work on South Sudan. I'm a PhD candidate, and my question is, so I've talked about economics earlier, and I was wondering if you guys see in your different contexts any interventions that enable survivors of sexual violence to come out of their condition of victims, and innovative thinking, because my experience in South Sudan is that it's very nice to do counseling with victims of sexual violence, but when you send them back to their households afterwards with an abusive husband that they cannot leave because they're tied up by the system of bride wealth, then you end up wondering, are we doing good or bad? And so I'm wondering if you have any sort of ideas about what the international community could do better to provide an opportunity to these victims to come out of their status.
Okay, we have one more question we can take. I'm going to take one up there since she's already up there. The man there. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Ali Okowat. I'm a physician and GBV researcher from McGill University. One of the projects that we're working on in Africa is a multi-country study looking at the facilitators and barriers in the implementation of GBV laws. And I'd like to ask the panel in general if there are best practices that they've come across in helping victims of sexual violence to either access the justice system or to seek reparations from it. Thank you.
Thank you. Then I think we're going to turn to the panel. There were quite a few questions that were broad. Would anyone like to start, or should I just appoint someone? You want to go?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Sure. The perception of justice for these victims, I mean, is wide because at first they need economic reparation. This is justice at first, but then they are looking for education, mental health service. This is, in my country, it's not important, mental health. I mean, here also not. But for these women, it's very important to support psychological, to have a psychological support. And then they are looking for more opportunities in education for her, for their children, and so on. No? And also the survivor using another term in my country. They use affected by sexual violence or by violence. No? They don't want to be victims because of this resilience. No, I mean that they feel in this victim identity, they can't make something. No, but the problem is that the system push this woman to this term. In my country, it's very important the terminology. No. For example, if some perpetrator, female perpetrator, was in jail and she was a victim of rape between the tortures, she can't be a victim because we have a law that say in the 4th article, a victim is blah, 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 but these women sentenced or condemned by terrorists are not a victim. So it's very difficult, the term, no? Victim, affected, survivor. In my country, we don't use the term survivor. We don't use, we use affected, no? It's more wide and so on.
So I'd like to say something about Pascal's question. He's wondering whether we work with the religious leaders. I would say yes. At Hill Africa, we don't have only Wamama Simameni network, as I said, women stand up together, but we also have Nehemiah Committee. We bring together religious leaders from different denominations. And the biggest challenge was that at first they thought that Hill Africa is going to hire them. But we said, no, this is your community. We need to work for your community. But with time, they now understand. And they used to do mediation in the communities, but they've gone through many training about gender, sexual violence issues, because they understand that this is the biggest challenge in their community.
Go ahead. Yeah, respond. Also something about religious leaders. Our hospital, we have a chapel. The Catholic Church have a department, and we work close with them, and they have some seed funding so that we refer cases to them to provide seed money for the survivor to go and to start a small-scale business. And there are quite a number of people we have helped, and I must say that that's actually a success story for quite a number of the survivors we are working with. I wanted to comment something on the intervention. Somebody asked from South Sudan about the options when you do counseling, and you might not get very far because the victim has to go back home. Yes, we're also finding that a challenge, but for us, apart from the individual counseling, we run support groups. And in these support groups, they really help each other, and people with other survivors with similar problems make suggestions, and they learn from each other. And they also get socioeconomic empowerment, again, from the church and other partners. But during our counseling sessions, we really sit with them and ask, what are the options? Where can you go? And where we can facilitate, we involve our social worker and really try the best we can. And with our partners, like the team sitting there, Lydia and team, we are able to try and get them shelters. However, shelters are few and usually underfunded, so it can be a bit of a challenge. I wanted to answer the last one, the issue on barriers. Somebody who was doing study on barriers on implementation of the law. I know, from our side, we are finding that the barriers start even from the victim himself reporting the case. The survivor arrives, and maybe the perpetrator is a family member. And they report the case, but they realize later on that they depend on this family because they don't have a job, they don't have income, and the family relatives start ostracizing the victim. And so the victim is so helpless, ends up retracting, withdrawing the case. And that really is a barrier for us in implementation from the hospital side. I would like the legal people will talk about the legal approach. Another aspect is documentation. We had to design, for a long time we've used forms which were not capturing the necessary data. But now the law has actually approved certain forms called post-rape care forms, which have more details and pictures so that wherever we are capturing data, it is well captured enough to go to court and actually any medic can present the case. So I think that's a milestone ahead, the national forms which are now approved. Another issue is we have a bit of a barrier in the hospital of collecting specimens. As we examine the patient, we're supposed to collect the specimens during the examination and package them so that there's a chain of custody, and they end up with the police taking them to the government chemist. But there we have challenges. Sometimes the police say, but this is not my jurisdiction. Another police from another area should come and collect. So we end up with so many of the bags in our store waiting for some policeman to take to the government chemist. We cannot take them to the government chemist. And that's a gap that I hope our team, we can look at. And also the government chemist does not have capacity. The DNA machine is expensive. We do have equipment, but it's only one, and there are many, the country is large, we need more DNA equipment, etc. And then lastly, health services is basically under budgeted by the government. Yes, they've given us goodwill, they've trained all the staff. Maybe the government is currently supporting the multi-sectoral training of medical workers, magistrates, judiciary, team training, yeah, all over the country. And it's been going on for the last 5 years on management of GBV, and that's very nice. It's making a change. But the problem is, yes, the government is supporting the training, but the budget, the budget to the health sector is only less than 1% of the national budget. How do they expect us to implement what we have learned from the training? So that's my...
Could I ask Mariana to just comment on the therapy, and then Veronica will get the word?
When we start from individual to global, we also use effectively UN policies to press the government to establish the program for war rape survivors in campaign of more than 25 organizations and 50,000 signatures for recognition of the status of the civil victims of the war. On Bosnia CIDO report, periodical CIDO report in 2006, state got 2 recommendations to issue the program, comprehensive recovery program for the war rape survivors. This is now the one chapter of strategy for transitional justice. So this is the way to use UN policy as a tool to provide domestically establishing the program. Because although in Bosnia they were two strong organizations, what multidisciplinary, holistically supported for 10 or 15 years, all these programs, it wasn't enough to integrate war rape survivors in the society. The other thing what we need generally, this is the recovery of individuals, groups, and the communities as one of the Millennium Developmental Goals. Combating domestic violence, this is a goal now, and recovery of the communities is not the goal. So with poverty reduction, we need psychosocial reconstruction and more psychosocial programming to be able to work on recovery on trauma. When we assess the data, until 2002, after the Second World War, it was 107 wars in the whole world. So plus wars what were going on. And we don't have this community recovery or peace building as Millennium Developmental Goal. We need that on global level too.
Thank you. Veronica.
Yeah, I'll talk a little bit about South Sudan, then I will talk about the access to justice. In South Sudan, the poverty is so real and it is so much. Now, to understand the problem, we just need to understand the conflict. This was a liberation struggle that was taken from Khartoum or from the whole of Sudan into the bush or the forest, as they call it. Now, they didn't hold anything. All they had was the forest. When they got back to the capital of South Sudan, that is Juba, they found everything was, when the war was nearing to an end and the peace was taking more center stage, the Khartoum just bombed the whole of the south down to ground. So recovery is going to be a problem, it is, but there was so much international intervention, a lot of emergency money was given in. It wasn't structured. DDR was not structured. But now things, because there was no law books, nothing, no government, zero. So, now the structure is taking place and people are beginning to recover. Governance is being whatever. And to answer you, I think the most innovative thing or any other economic intervention we can give is microfinance. But before we give it, we must teach them how to use it, because it can also be contra sometimes when you have to pay back this money with interest and something like that. But yes, I'm glad that issue of South Sudan came up. It really, that country needs attention. Now, on the helping the victims access justice. One of the things that I involve myself with the group that we work with is to trace it from the international, to wake up the countries about the international instruments that they sign, hold them accountable, monitor their compliance with those. Because it's so easy for a state party to say, oh, that is not done in my country. I mean, I'm a colleague of Chris in another area of gay rights in Uganda and other problems. I'm not going to talk about it now. But we tend to hide behind tradition, behind whatever. And then we go and sign these international treaties that we do not implement, we do not practice, and then citizens suffer because aid has been denied in some areas because they say, look, what is happening? Just before we left Uganda, 2 weeks ago, a university closed, and there are students on the streets. These are human beings. And now when you talk about the vulnerable survivor group, then it is a problem. So we tend to hold the state party accountable. Then at the national level, we have the laws. In fact, the regions I'm talking about have the most beautiful laws. My colleague mentioned it yesterday about, we don't lack laws or legislation. The problem is implementation. And then the commitment of government to implement these laws. So we try as much as possible to make sure that these cases actually end up in courts, in the courts of law. And even where they've asked for a forum to discuss it and agree on a traditional forum, we still say, yes, this is a mediation. Let us document it and go and get a court stamp so that, you know, we are trying to build local jurisprudence. And at one time, it was so desperate that we have, Kathleen asked about terminology. What is rape? What is sexual violence? What is this? We even have another one, defilement. We had to differentiate between rape and then rape of the most vulnerable. Now, defilement here is rape of a non-adult, minor. And we take this more seriously. This is where we went to the government and said people who rape minors, 3-year-old, what was the lowest we had? 2-week-old, and then you tell me this one has to go be given bail and given other things, you know. So there is a scaling of this And then, of course, finally, we try to preserve as much as possible the evidence. You have to document these things when they are still hot. We have civil society. There is the FIDA, which is it's a French, I think it is Federation something, but everybody knows FIDA Uganda. It's a federation of international women lawyers. We have ISIS Wiki, which is a cross-cultural group. Now, their job is usually just to go to these areas, go to the grassroots, and on behalf of members, document these things and keep evidence for the time when we need it most. I remember trying a case, this is a final one, trying a case, and then the judge is asking, I was not prosecuting, I was a defense lawyer at that time, and they were asking, no, a victim's lawyer, give me the evidence. Madam, can you cite the law? I mean, I looked at this and I had no law to cite, and then I said it is in the Bible. And, you know, because I had to tell him something. It is true, I didn't have the law. The other thing, of course, also is, as I said, improve on the jurisprudence and document all the work of the tribunals and all that.
Thank you, Veronica. Chris, did you want to say something now, or?
I think there was a question directly to me about the LGBTI refugees. I think the interesting thing there, which is how it relates to, and you asked about how it relates to heterosexism and homophobia. I think one of the way in which it relates in terms of refugees is that many refugees are arriving without ever having had a discussion about their sexual orientation or gender identity. So the discussion begins as a discussion around work, and sex work in particular. And we saw that in terms of the group that established itself. When it established itself 2 or 3 years ago, it was a sex worker group. It's now very distinctly an LGBTI group. And so there's been a sort of transition as the members of the group have become aware of what is available to them in terms of a discourse, in terms of labels. I was very skeptical about it. I thought, well, this is the worst thing that can happen, is that people get put into these boxes that have been defined elsewhere. But actually, in terms of working with that particular group of people, they have found it very empowering to be able to say, well, actually, I'm this or I'm that. Both at a personal level, and then also in terms of, from a funding point of view, it's easier to raise money as an LGBTI group than as a sex worker group, particularly if you're looking to America for funding. So there are some interesting issues in there. I think there are a lot of challenges that we could discuss outside in terms of how the UN itself is very challenged working on these issues because of their relationship to the host government. And in a context like Uganda, that is particularly difficult. Particularly right now, we have the anti-homosexuality bill, which is back on the order of parliament. But to all intents and purposes, it was passed 3 years ago, and people are already behaving as if it were in law. The question about the slippage between male victims and homosexuality, and this is a serious problem both for service providers and for the victims themselves. So the service providers, they have, I suppose, are located in a place where the law doesn't distinguish between consensual and non-consensual. And so they fear that if they work with male survivors, they're actually working with homosexuals. And as I say, the anti-homosexuality bill would punish that. So that you get a slippage there. For the victims themselves, it's not, I didn't get time to talk about it, but there's no doubt that many victims feel very challenged around their own sexual orientation. As a general comment, I think one of the adjustments that has to happen in this whole discussion about sexual violence is, can we please bring sex, sexuality, sexual orientation into the discussion? It's barely there, and actually it's fundamental to getting a proper understanding of what is going on, both for the perpetrators and for the victims, and it's just not there. I think, if I may speak to the question of religious leaders, I think is a great, and of different colors. It's a huge problem. I mean, there is no buy-in at all, whether on male survivors or on LGBTI survivors, from the organized religions. And I think in Uganda we have one courageous ex-bishop who lost his position as a bishop precisely because he openly advocated for LGBTI rights. In terms of male survivors of sexual violence who are not necessarily themselves LGBTI, there are a number of pastors amongst them. To me, that is the only hope, is that they, as survivors, will start to think differently and preach differently. And let me finish just in terms of best practices. It's really a question, to me it's been mentioned several times over the last day and a half, the sort of emerging jurisprudence. And to me, I'm actually not personally a great fan of the ICC's practice to date, but I do love the definition of rape. And I think it really represents a very important advance on many existing definitions. Let me just read it, because it kind of captures the issue of, it's a definition which allows for both male and female victims and male and female perpetrators. And so in that sense, if I've understood the history of it properly, it comes out of the ICTR, ICTY. So it represents best practice. And the definition is that the perpetrator invaded the body of a person by conduct resulting in the penetration, however slight, of any part of the victim, any part of the body of the victim or of the perpetrator. So that allows for the woman who forces the man to have sex with her, with a sexual organ, or of the anal or genital opening of the victim. It's interesting that they put anal before genital, with any object or any other part of the body. So, I myself have only understood this definition fairly recently, but I think it represents a huge advance on most of the existing ones, and that we should look to that as a really important reference point.
Thank you. Can you be short?
Yes, very short.
Thank
I
you.
would like to say something about innovation, because the organization has gone through a learning process. And before we used to provide economic support to survivors only. And we wanted to empower them, and we thought that this could reduce the gender-based violence, but it was just the contrary. The most we wanted to empower them, the most they were more and more victim of gender-based violence. So what we did, we are now involving men in all process. It's 30%. Let it be in our Mama Sinameni network, we have men. In our safe motherhood programs, we have men, and this helps a lot. They are no longer resistant to our programs and to gender equity.
Thank you. We'll have another round of questions. Yes, I'm aware. Would you like to ask a question?
Yes, thank you. Again, I'm Liberata Mulamula from Tanzania. I just want to thank the panelists for very enlightening revelations. Dr. Chris, I think from what you have said, next time around we should have more men in the panel. I just wanted also to ask you, who are the consumers of your findings? I know you are in Kampala. We had a summit which Veronica mentioned. This was at the highest level, and we really did a lot of groundwork, but because we needed a lot of inputs, but I don't think if you was part of what was decided in Kampala. But my question is about the centers. I've been at the Hill Center many times. When we were deciding on the three, yesterday they spoke of the 3 Ps, we added another P to provide assistance to victims. Now they are called survivors. But then there was another argument that if you have these centers everywhere, you are stigmatizing more of these people, of the survivors, because now they are isolated. In the hospitals, they are put in special units. So everybody identifies them of what would not want to be seen. So I was asking whether this is still the notion. I'm happy that the Hill Center is now mixing the survivors and the other members of the community, maybe to remove that stigma. But I wanted to hear your views about these centers. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. Let's see, the woman over there.
Thank you. I'm Meredith Tertian from Rutgers University. I wanted to come back to Mariana's question about the community, because most of what we have heard is about the individual. And Dr. Wood this morning mentioned that what really distinguishes sexual violence and war is that it's a community experience. And this carries over into all the discussion about reparation. That again, we hear about the individual getting compensation, not the community. I'd like to hear comment on that.
Thank you for being very brief. Since you're so brief, we'll allow 2 more questions, very brief questions. Let's see. The woman there to the, yes.
Hi, Susanna Sirkin from Physicians for Human Rights. Really appreciated the conversation and around the integration of services and the challenges of a one-stop shop versus services that include access to justice with treatment in remote areas where you can't have a one-stop shop. I'm wondering how can one deliver that more holistic approach in remote areas, and what are the obstacles and challenges? We're working very hard with trying to just created a mobile application, for example, that will enable people to take that standard form that you have in Kenya, for example, and enable people in remote areas to actually do that same kind of documentation. But there are many, many challenges, and I'm just wondering how that will work, especially for men, male victims as well, where so much of the services are integrated into women's health care, which is another big dilemma.
Thank you. Let's see. Someone who hasn't asked before. I think the woman far up there to the right. You haven't asked. Oh, okay. Thank you.
Hi.
I'm sorry.
Jana Applebaum, PhD candidate, sociology, NYU. I wanted to bring it back to the question about community. And introduce, I know it's a massive topic, but the issue of reconciliation. I wanted to ask about, particularly when there's a case brought about sexual violence, how that affects reconciliation with the wives, mothers, sisters, daughters, whatever, of the men who are accused.
Thank you. I'm going to ask the panelists to respond however they wish, and also give their final comments at the same time. So I think I'll start on this end with Mariana.
Okay, we could come to the mental health issue about integrated service in one hospital, to try to integrate for rape survivors with other survivors, or to one-stop shop, one-spot integrated center like medical, like Viva Žene in Bosnia and Herzegovina appear. It was a long discussion in the beginning of the establishment of the center with advantages and disadvantages of both. Feminists and we follow and use word war rape, not euphemism. When you look at the psychiatric language, you find even now, 20 years later, expression unpleasant event happened. It is a war crime and crime against humanity. It's not any unpleasant event. So it covers, euphemisms covers the real atrocity and the real consequences of the traumatization what women passed. Medica Zenica was established as integrated center, but 12 years later, with the withdrawal of donors from Bosnia and Herzegovina, it has to disintegrate. So it was very comprehensive, very integrated, and then we came in position to negotiate about cutting the services. So what we preserve and what we cut now, we preserve the shelter because there are no any other safe place for different survivors. For re-traumatization of war rape survivors when they return to their villages, to their places of living. And when they are facing neighbors or perpetrators or the other perpetrators who committed a crime in their particular area. So we had cases where women relapses again and 2-3 times return to the shelter. So because of those reasons we need shelter, and especially we need shelter because of domestic violence cases. So we didn't cut the services, but we cut extension of services. Gynecological ambulance, we negotiate with local hospital that our clients have the free access. General medical checkups also that hospital provide free access. And we preserve mobile gynecological ambulance because it reaches a lot of remote places, and five women who for 20 years didn't make any sort of checkups and 5 malignant diseases in the field and refer to further treatment and other. So we see this integration. The center was multidisciplinary, multisectorially integrated, and could be the center for any Western country. But it is, as we all know, it is small hospital or small hotel, and it is very expensive. So just with withdrawal of the donors, although it was a quality service and needed service, we needed to disintegrate and to cut the services. So we preserve the function of the services. Yeah.
Thank you. Roque, would you like to go next?
Okay, comparison for me is very difficult because in Peru we don't have this kind of service. We don't have hospital or training groups or workshop. We only have a law, very beautiful, no? And we can implement. We can put this implementation in fact, no? And we have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. This is very difficult for us. Here, Yulisa is the writer of the gender section of this, the final report. And we have more than 100 of recommendations, and the government made nothing. No? Also, it's difficult in my organization because lawyers, attorneys, prosecutors don't believe the victims, and they say, "Okay, we need a proof 30 years after." It's impossible, no? And it's very hard for us to also to share with the victims. And the community, when, for example, yesterday Yulisa talked about Manta. Manta is a very small town, and the male now say that we can't talk about rape and we can't talk about sexual violence because of we are involved, because we remember that we are cowards to protect our women. And this is very difficult to search justice now. No? So
thank you. I'm going to ask the rest of the panel to respond too, but I'm afraid we're going to have to ask you also to be brief because there is lunch waiting. But we can continue discussions over lunch, but please a few words if you like.
Just to be sure, very brief. Okay, holistic approach. She wants to know how that is made possible in remote areas. This is made possible thanks to our outreach team. Because in some remote areas, we don't even have hospital, but we have outreach services. So thanks to that, it's made possible. And also, we work with, we collaborate with existing structures on the field. And about men victims, it's such a shame that men want to keep it a secret. But whenever they come to Hill Africa, they are treated. Because last year, we have 7% of survivors of sexual violence were men treated at Hill Africa. So we also treat men. As a recommendation, am I supposed to do now?
Yes.
Okay. One-sided focus on women is often accompanied by one-sided focus on sexual violence. And as I said, given that we are in a context of generalized violence, this generates further conflict and more stigma towards survivors. So what should be better, it could be to abandon a single issue approach and to distribute more equally funding and attention among the vulnerable populations.
Thank you.
Just commenting quickly on the stigma in the GBV centers. For us, it's a new service we were creating as a one-stop shop. We had to, first of all, study it and start it and see what are we doing, and then document the guidelines, the protocols. And remember, we are a teaching referral hospital, so we had to set up this and see how it flows. And then now we are in the phase of trying to roll it out to the county levels And right now, the Ministry of Health have a home-based care guidelines, so linking the referral hospitals, county hospitals to the community through community health workers. So we have a vision and the direction we want to go. Of course, it has its challenges because of under-budgeting. And there are some areas, like our youth center is actually integrated. They're dealing with family planning, GBV, and others. In the long run, we want to integrate the services once we have defined exactly what we want to do.
Thank you. Veronica.
Yeah, on the community and the reparations, so what I think on sexual violence, this has been more of the individual success, not so much of a community. But for Rwanda, I mean in the region that I cover, for Rwanda it is slightly different, and I think it was treated en masse. We talked about Gacaca courts yesterday. And for also northern Uganda, we have what they call it a local traditional way of reconciling people. And that was, it is very popular. Professor Vuga talked about it yesterday. People the community tend to like it because you are first of all asked as a perpetrator to own in front of your victims and survivors that you did it, and then to apologize, and then you are reconciled. So the process it covers all those ingredients of reconciliation, acceptance, and that kind of thing. And the victims tend to like it better than other processes. Maybe as a parting remark, I would say we put out a question to survivors and victims in no order and in an alphabetical order, and we asked them, what would you want done if you had the right, if you had the authority? So we said, peace, justice, do you want to go home? Do you want food? Do you want compensation? Reconciliation, accountability, or justice? And justice, these are about 8 issues. Justice was the second last. All of them tended to want peace, forgiveness, reconciliation, because it is where they live. It's the community. We can't isolate them from their homes.
Thank you, Veronica. Chris?
Thanks. There was a question about who are the consumers of our findings. I think the first consumers are the survivors themselves. And there's definitely a kind of word-of-mouth process which happens as a result of which we get far more people getting referred to us for assistance. Health service providers who are gradually starting to think differently about how they deliver services. We bring our materials into trainings on GBV with the police, with prisons officers, with immigration officers. UNHCR, I have to make a little plug for this booklet here. This is a consumption of our findings, a digest of them, which is available on the table at the back, which has been turned into a need-to-know guidance note for their own staff. Al Jazeera have talked about them. BBC World Service have talked about them. For those who are particularly interested, I have some copies of those available. Unfortunately, not enough to give to everybody. And many universities have used these materials for teaching purposes. In terms of the question about community reparation, I can't answer it very directly, but there's an interesting process that links to one of the videos I could give people, where survivors told their story, this is male survivors told their story on film, and then asked for it to be screened in their own communities. And in their own communities, there was a massive response to that, and we ended up in 2 small villages with 18 survivors coming up and telling their stories subsequently. So clearly, and so far we've had no bad impact on the people who told their stories on the film. So there was clearly a kind of community appetite to have this story, which really was a kind of it was a community trauma. It wasn't an individual trauma. It was also a community trauma, even if the individuals are hidden. So that was an interesting dynamic. Just as a closing comment, I really wanted to speak to the economics issue. I think, and again, looking at it from a male survivor point of view, if you don't have that economic recovery, then there is no possibility of social recovery. In terms of existing models of masculinity and men as providers and so on, if you don't deal with that part of the equation, you're really leaving someone in complete limbo. The problem is a systemic one in terms of, particularly for refugees who are kind of the victims, not just of what happened to them, but also of the humanitarian system and the refugee system, which individualizes their problem and focuses on their problem and doesn't look at all at what capacities they have and what potential they have also to develop new capacities. So there's a big systemic problem in terms of what kind of interventions you can even get funded. Microfinance, try getting money for microfinance for refugees. It's not easy.
Thank you. Mariama,
and for the treatments of the community, this is what we are lacking. So we need comprehensive approach towards trauma healing, directed to biological, to body healing, to psychosocial, human rights approach, educational role of media, and cathartic role of art. Art is healing power, like Grbavica movie was in Bosnia and Herzegovina.
Thank you. Thank you to all the panelists for very interesting discussions and for broadening our understanding of survival. Thank you.
And thank you to our fabulous moderators there. It's, again, very frustrating because I know there are a lot of questions, there's a lot of conversation. Please carry it into our lunch. We have a lunch until about 2 o'clock, but before you break, we have found an older version of a BlackBerry, and it is locked, so I haven't seen any of your emails. But if you're missing your BlackBerry and you might be from the State Department, please come see me.